Well, Proverbs essentially is an entire book in the Bible with prescriptions of how to do life the right way. If you ever wondered what's the secret of life, look in Proverbs, because through its 31 chapters, it gives such practical, wise advice about how to live and live well. Now, last time I spoke with you a few weeks ago, we looked at what are perhaps the best-known verses in Proverbs, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. So we looked at that. We talked about trusting in the Lord. And today I'd like to build on that by asking the question, what does real-life trust in the Lord look like? And if we follow this passage in Proverbs 3, we soon see these words of a very specific way of putting this trust into practice. Proverbs 3, 9, and 10. Honor the Lord with your substance and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Now, let me give you some background here. This is the only verse in all of Proverbs that refers to something in Israel's ceremonial law. Much of Proverbs is just good, wise advice, certainly godly advice, but this is the only place in Proverbs that refers to the religion of Israel, specifically some of the practices of the religion of Israel. When God formed the nation of Israel during the Exodus, one of the commandments that God gave was called the first fruits offering. You know that ancient Israel was an entirely agrarian economy, all farming, sheep herding. And 3 times a year, there would be harvest time. There'd be different harvests for different things through the year. And at each of these 3 major harvests, the people were commanded by God to bring their very first fruits, the first things that were produced, the first grains, the first olive oil, the first wine, the first lamb, the firstborn calf, anything that was produced. The very first at that harvest was to go into the temple to help support the work of God, the work of the priests. Eventually, these 3 harvests were all kind of combined into one major festival, which became known as one of the 7 major festivals of Israel, the festival of the first fruits. And the first fruits festival was always at the time of the spring harvest, right after Passover. And an interesting detail is that Jesus rose from the dead on the day of the first fruits. So when in the New Testament, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus is the first fruits of all who have died and will rise again. It's a beautiful way that God made that happen. On the very day of first fruits that Israel was remembering hundreds of years ago, this offering that they would bring, and they had been doing this for centuries. The first fruits was all about, right off the top, the people were to bring the very first things they produced as an offering to God. Now, Exodus 23:19 gives even more specificity about the first fruits offering. It says, "The choicest of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God." The choicest of the first fruits. Let's say your tomato plant. The first time it produces tomatoes, produces about 5 tomatoes. 4 of them are kind of puny and kind of pockmarked, but there's one really succulent tomato on that plant of your first 5 that come. Now, you might be tempted, I know I might be tempted to think, well, those 4 are good enough. But no, the commandment specifically says the choicest of your first fruits. So that means taking that one succulent, prize-winning tomato and bringing that and giving it away to the temple. Now, this is several hundred years after God has instituted the first fruits offering that we see here in Proverbs this verse. Honor the Lord with your substance, with your wealth, and with the first fruits of your produce. Now remember, we're in the context of trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. So just think about this for a moment. You're a poor farmer, totally dependent on the forces of nature for your well-being. How many of you came from a farm background of some kind? Well, you all know what it's like to depend. Well, actually, frankly, we all know about it after this last week, don't we? We saw that storm coming towards Florida. We were completely helpless. I mean, we could do some things to try to save ourselves, but the weather was totally out of our control. And so imagine that you're this farmer in ancient Israel, totally dependent on the conditions beyond your control. And then the very first thing that is produced in your harvest, the harvest that you and your family depend on for your life, for your livelihood, with no guarantee that anything else is going to come. Remember that. This is the first harvest, the first fruits. There's no guarantee that anything else is going to come out of the ground. Any other babies are going to be born on the farm. And the farmer brings those precious first fruits as an offering, giving it all away to God and God's purposes in the world. That's trusting in the Lord with all your heart. It's a kind of radical, courageous trust that I admittedly do not begin to approach in my life. But it's awfully compelling. And I don't want to shake my head and just say, that's impossible kind of faith. Because I really don't want to miss out on the adventurous, exhilarating life of faith that we cannot possibly experience when we play it safe. And so are you with me in just kind of being intrigued about all of this? That kind of trust in the Lord with all your heart. You see, first fruits, it's not about the amount a person gives. First fruits is about the attitude of the giver. In Deuteronomy 26, Moses, before the people crossed over into the promised land, reminded them of this first fruits offering. And he said, when the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. So all the people of Israel were to remember this response. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. That's Abraham. He went down into Egypt, it's Joseph, and lived there as an alien, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And He brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. It's the attitude of recognizing that everything we have comes from God. That we are all descendants of that wandering Aramean. And in the New Covenant, we can say that we are all redeemed sinners who are saved by the gift of Jesus Christ on the cross. We have no claim to anything in this life. I mean, think about when we're born. We come in with nothing. We go out with nothing. Everything we receive is a gift from God. And this attitude of first fruits is an attitude of as Proverbs 3:9 says, honoring God with our substance, recognizing that God gets the glory, and then living by faith, trusting that God is good and will provide. Now, here's the reality. Most of us are generous in ways that really don't require a whole lot of faith. I think of the story of a lady who called the Butterball Turkey Company. She had had a turkey in her deep freeze for 23 years, and she wanted to call to see if it was still safe to eat. Well, they told her that if the thermometer had stayed below zero for all those years, that it probably was not dangerous to eat, but they warned her that the flavor would have deteriorated considerably over all that time. And she said, "Thanks so much. I just wanted to check before I gave it to the church." Now, most of us, really, we're generous in ways that really don't require a lot of faith. If you're like me, you carefully estimate your income, and you determine your fixed living expenses, and then you portion out the rest. Now, Karen and I have always made a principle in our marriage to automatically give at least 10% of all of our income to God. That's tithing. But at the same time, I have to admit, we've arranged our life in such a way that even tithing doesn't carry a whole lot of risk. Sure, there are pleasures we choose not to afford. There's always more we could be investing for our retirement. But really, we can get away with tithing without it really requiring us to put a whole lot of faith in God to provide for our daily bread. And then I think of the daring faith adventure of the farmer who brings his first fruits and says, "God, here is the first of my crop, the firstborn of my flocks. I don't know if more crops or more babies are coming, but everything I have comes from you. And I trust your promise that as we give sacrificially, you will make sure that by your gracious hand we will have all that we need." Hear these words again. Honor the Lord with your substance and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. See, part of why it's hard for us to give those first fruits is we're afraid that our barns are going to be empty. But God promises He'll take care of us. Now, please understand, this is very important. This is not a promise that if we give, God will make us rich. There's something out there called the prosperity gospel. You hear it sometimes on TV. You see it around the world that says if you just sacrifice your money, God is not only going to return it, but He is going to bless you and you're going to be rich. That's not biblical. What the biblical promise is as we give, trusting God, we can give knowing and trusting that God will make sure we have what we need. That is a promise we can bank on. Now, some will say the Old Testament laws about giving don't apply in the New Covenant. And you sometimes hear this about tithing. Well, granted, the New Testament does not command us to give 10%. But what does the New Testament say? Well, Jesus told Zacchaeus to give away half of everything he had and give it to the poor. Jesus told the rich young man to give away everything he owned and follow him. He invited the 12 disciples to leave their nets or their businesses behind, to forsake it all to follow him. And one of the people Jesus commends with the highest praise in all of the Gospels is that poor widow who gives her last coin in the temple treasury, all that she had. So, the spirit of generosity only magnifies in the New Testament, not as a law, but as a privilege. As we have seen how God has given his first fruits to us. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. On the cross, Jesus gave it all. And in that outpouring of love, we have been freed to live courageously and to show the world what it means to trust a magnificent, faithful God. Now, obviously, our worship today does not involve offerings of grain, olive oil, wine, grapes, farm animals. Might look rather strange here if that were the case. So what might a first fruits offering or a first fruits approach tangibly look like for you and for me? And I'd just like to leave you with really quick 5 things just to kind of consider in terms of developing this first fruits approach. They're not going to be on the screen, so you may want to write them down just really quickly. First of all, I think a first fruits approach to life begins with desire. The desire to indeed be the kind of person who trusts in the Lord with all your heart. See, if we don't desire, if we don't aspire to that kind of faith, it's easy to just kind of say, let other people do it. But pay attention to that desire. Pay attention to that sense of, wow, that's really intriguing. Am I holding back? Am I missing something in life? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. This is a lifelong process of growing in trust, but it starts with that inner desire. And then second, whenever you have an opportunity to give an offering to God, I'd encourage you to think about the farmer bringing his first fruits. Whenever you have an opportunity to give, whether it's in the offering plate or a food drive or a gift to a mission partner like Family Promise or every year at your church or this church when we give a pledge card. And by the way, there's no pledge card coming today. Every now and then it's okay to talk about money when there's no special appeal from the church. Because it's a spiritual issue. It's not really about the church's need to receive. It's about our need to give so that we can have a fulfilling life. That's what Proverbs is talking about. So whenever we have an opportunity to give, remember that farmer and think about that spirit of trust. And a good way to really practice developing this first fruits approach is whenever we come into some new money. When that money comes into your hands, think first fruits. Maybe you sell some property. Maybe you make something in the stock market, or you get a bonus at work, or an income tax refund. Maybe you get some money for your birthday. I mean, I know most of us are probably too old to get money for our birthday, but I think I was about 25 and I was still getting $10 every year from Aunt Pat and Uncle John. And then let me just mention it. I mean, I wonder whether I should say this or not, but we got to be real here. If you win in gambling, it should be non-negotiable that you should think first fruits if people actually do win at gambling. Fourth thing to think about very specifically. I encourage you to make your life's final offering a beautiful gift of first fruits. I'm not going to ask how many of you have remembered the church or missions in your will. But one of the great tragedies in our nation is that good church-going people who have given faithfully in the offering week after week, year after year, when they pass from this earth, they haven't even thought about leaving a legacy for God's kingdom. And I could talk for a long time about this, but the thing is, there's so many in our nation still, thankfully, tax advantages. If we just put some of our estate towards charity and church and goodwill, and that actually may not even affect what we leave for other descendants all that much. Maybe you've never thought about that, but think first fruits. Sit down with your financial advisor and think about those first fruits and making your final offering of your life something that blesses God's kingdom. And finally, 5, I'm just going to be real specific here with a challenge. This very week, I challenge each of us to make a first fruits kind of offering to the kingdom of God. It could be to this church. It could be to Family Promise, to the relief work in Haiti, or to some mission that's doing God's work. If being together in worship is meant to send us out changed and ready to live boldly for our Lord Jesus Christ, then how sad if we walk out saying, "Boy, that was a good sermon," and then go on living as if Christ has not set us free to live generously and to love extravagantly. Preparing the sermon, I heard a story from Ron Allen, who's a professor at Christian Seminary in Indiana. And he talks about a few years ago when a visitor from the African nation of Lesotho visited his congregation. And he shared a story of a need in that land of southern Africa. The people in that part of Lesotho were living in hunger and poverty with very few educational resources, with very few pastors for many congregations. The church wonderfully was growing in Lesotho, but the churches were very spread out in this rural country, and there's only one pastor for every 20 congregations. And that pastor would have to travel on foot because of the topography of Lesotho. And so the appeal was made to this congregation in the United States, could you help us buy a horse? Which was the most efficient mode of transportation in that country, bereft of good roads or sources of gasoline. Well, a 5th grader sitting there in the church named BJ heard this request. And he was moved.